The crown of shadows, the wind howled through the skeletal trees of the English countryside, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. Somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf cried out, its mournful wail echoing across the desolate landscape. In the heart of London, within the cold stone walls of the Tudor palace, Elizabeth Tudor sat alone in her chamber, her fingers tracing the edge of a letter. The parchment was crisp, the ink dark and smudged, as though the writer had pressed too hard in their haste. The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a death sentence: the Stewarts march. James claims the throne. Elizabeth's lips curled into a thin, bloodless smile. She had always known this day would come. The Stewarts, those upstart pretenders from the north, had been a thorn in her family's side for generations. Once mere stewards to Scottish kings, they had clawed their way to power, their ambition as cold and unyielding as the Highland winters. And now, James Stuart, their so-called king, dared to claim her crown. The thought made her blood boil. She rose from her chair, her movements slow and deliberate, and crossed the room to the window. Outside, the city lay shrouded in darkness, the flickering light of torches casting long, jagged shadows on the cobblestone streets. Somewhere out there, her spies were watching, waiting, ready to strike at her command. But Elizabeth knew that spies alone would not be enough to stop James. The Stewards were cunning, their loyalty bought with gold and fear. To defeat them, she would need to dig deeper into the darkness. Before I move on, please help a small channel grow by liking and subscribing. It helps a lot. Also, your comments are very welcome, good or bad, as they help create better content. Now let's move on. Far to the north, in the draughty halls of Stirling Castle, James Stuart paced the length of his chamber, his boots echoing against the stone floor. The fire in the hearth had long since burned down to embers, but he paid it no mind. His thoughts were consumed by the coming war. The Tudors had ruled England for over a century, their power unchallenged, their bloodline unbroken. But James was no fool. He knew that power was an illusion, a fragile thing that could be shattered with the right blow. He stopped before the window, his breath fogging the glass as he stared out at the moonlit landscape. The Highlands stretched out before him, wild and untamed, a reflection of his own heart. The Stewards had waited centuries for this moment, biding their time, serving kings and queens who thought them little more than servants. Now, the time had come to rise. Behind him, the door creaked open, and one of his advisors stepped inside. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "My lord," he began, his voice trembling, "the Tudor agents. They've been spotted in the village. They're gathering information, spreading rumors. We must act quickly." James turned, his eyes glinting like shards of ice. "Let them come," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Let them see what happens to those who oppose me." The first blow came in the dead of night. A Tudor loyalist, a man who had served Elizabeth's father, was found in a ditch outside London, his throat slit from ear to ear. Clutched in his hand was a single white rose, its petals stained with blood. The message was clear: the Stewards were coming. Elizabeth received the news with a cold, calculating calm. She had expected as much. James was a man of action, not words, and he would stop at nothing to see her family destroyed. But Elizabeth was no stranger to violence. She had survived the Wars of the Roses, the fall of her father, the death of her brother. She would survive this too. She summoned her most trusted advisors, their faces grim in the flickering candlelight. "We must strike back," she said, her voice steady. "We must show James that the Tudors do not bow to traitors." Her agents were dispatched, their orders clear: sow discord among James's allies, weaken his support, and bring him to his knees. Gold changed hands, promises were made and broken, and the shadows grew darker. But James was ready. He had anticipated Elizabeth's moves, his own spies weaving a web of deceit that ensnared the Tudor agents. One by one, they fell, their bodies left as warnings to those who would oppose him. The game was afoot, and the stakes were higher than ever. As the months turned to years, the conflict grew more brutal. Villages were burned, their inhabitants slaughtered or driven from their homes. Fields that had once been lush and green were now barren wastelands, the earth scorched by fire and stained with blood. Families were torn apart, fathers and sons forced to fight on opposite sides, their loyalty to their families pitted against their loyalty to their rulers. The people whispered of curses, of a darkness that had taken root in the hearts of their rulers. They spoke of the Tudor rose, once a symbol of hope and unity, now withered and blackened by the weight of ambition. They spoke of the Steward lion, its roar a harbinger of death and destruction. But still, the Tudors and the Stewarts fought on, their hatred for each other burning brighter than the sun. In the end, it was not strength or cunning that decided the outcome, but fate. Elizabeth fell ill, her body racked with pain, and her son Henry proved too weak to hold the Tudor line together. The once mighty dynasty began to crumble, its foundations weakened by years of war and betrayal. James, ever the opportunist, seized his chance. He marched south, his army a shadowy tide that swept aside all resistance. The Tudor rose withered, and the Steward lion roared in triumph. London fell, its streets running red with blood, and James stood in the ruins of the Tudor court, the crown of England and Scotland resting heavily on his head. But as he looked out over the shattered remains of his enemy's kingdom, he felt no joy. The shadows that had carried him to victory now clung to him, whispering of betrayal and death. He had won, but at what cost? The land was broken, the people weary, and the darkness he had embraced would never let him go. And so, the first King of England and Scotland ruled from a throne of shadows, his legacy forged in blood and fire. The Tudors were gone, but their ghosts lingered, haunting the halls of power. And in the darkness, the game continued, eternal and unyielding. For in the end, the crown was not a prize, but a curse. And the shadows would always hunger. Please help my small channel grow, like and subscribe.